Welcome back. I'm Adam Ruffner. That's Cameron Brock. This is Swing Pass, and we are here to discuss the 2024 UFA full schedule release. That's right, 144 regular season games spread across 24 teams spanning almost 4 months of play. Cameron, you've been a vet of this league now for going into your 12th season. It's going to be your 12th season. 2024. What can you tell about us kind of about the road of the regular season in this league? And then we'll get into some of our favorite matchups of the slate of games. Obviously, there's way too many to actually choose from and discuss on this individual pod, and we will be previewing many more matchups as we get closer and closer to the 2024 season. But we kind of wanted to take a little bit of a glance at the games that we were most excited for. But first, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about what it's like to endure the 12-game slate that is the UFA regular season.
Yeah, I mean, just keep in mind, I back in the day had to do a 16-game slate in the regular season.
16 to 14 to 12 beginning in 2018 or 19?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
19 was the first 12-game slate, I believe. I'm losing my history now.
Yeah, it all starts to run together. It's interesting, too, because everyone kind of sets their schedule up differently. This is actually the first year where we're going to have a doubleheader weekend, I think, since 2018. I don't think we had one in 2019. I know we haven't. Or I take that back. In 2021, before I rejoined the team, they did open with a doubleheader weekend. But I didn't have to partake in that. But the last 2 years, we have not had any doubleheader weekends, and that's been really nice. It does take up another weekend of having Ultimate, obviously, and it does, depending on who you are as a person, you might prefer to have some doubleheader weekends to give you some weekends off during the season. Although, let's be real, a lot of us on our off weekends are filling it up with more Ultimate anyways, so it's an off weekend is not always just sitting on the couch or doing something else. It sometimes is just doing more Ultimate things. But the thing that's so cool, just like in every other sport, is at the beginning of the season and in the preseason as we build towards opening day, is that everyone is 0-0 right now. That hope is alive for everybody. Some teams have their eyes on maybe making the playoffs for the first time in a few years. Some teams are looking to maybe take over the top spot in their division. And for teams who got to championship weekend last year, maybe they're thinking about what can they do to take that next step, going from semifinal to final, or, there is the standard at the top. How can anyone knock off the New York Empire, right? That's maybe what some teams are thinking about right now. For me, not a problem I got to worry about right now, but I would love to have that problem maybe later on in the season if possible.
That's right. I mean, you guys have one of the more favorable schedules going into 2024. The AlleyCats do. You have an ambitious home game against Atlanta early on in the season, but other than that, you host Minnesota one time, you host Madison one time, you host Chicago one time, you get Detroit twice at home, you get Pittsburgh at home. Pretty good odds for Indy. I know Daniel Cohen is working on an article right now talking about strength of schedule. He compiled a list of all 24 teams right now. AlleyCats have the second easiest schedule going into 24 season. That's based off of 2023 win-loss records. So we'll still see if that holds true in reality as we get set for games beginning on April 26th. That will be the date of opening poll 2024. But right now, I want to get into Cam and I's favorite matchups. We're each going to select 3, go back and forth, kind of break down some of the more anticipated games that we see unfolding, both in interdivisional play and as far as divisional rivalries go. I'm going to kick it over to Cam first for him to select his top choice going into the 2024 season.
Yeah, so it was hard to choose between 144 games where to start.
A lot of choices.
It is a lot. And, there are lots of things that intrigue me going into the season. For instance, Seattle is returning a bunch of players that were really important for them last year, and they haven't really been able to return players year after year. So seeing those early signings of some of their biggest, most impact players last year, I'm really curious to see how they do. And I'm really curious, we've talked about Oakland on the pod already a couple of times. Can they take that step, that next step really in maturity on the field and their decision making? And, there's just a lot to parse through. But, when it comes down to just a handful of games that we're going to talk about, we, want to talk about games that are really going to maybe have an impact on who wins a division. And so my first game, and forgive me, everybody, I have not really talked about the AlleyCats on this podcast, but I'm going to today. The first game is Minnesota at Indy in Week 7 for me. This is a huge game. Obviously, I will be playing in this game, but we only play Minnesota once this year. So this is a 1 versus 2 matchup from last year. This is a game in Indianapolis, in Grand Park, no wind, which if there's a team in the league that uses the wind to their advantage, I'm not sure there's one that does it better or does it more than Minnesota. And they, as we've talked about before, as you have talked about a lot in the pod in the past, that home field advantage they have with those swirly conditions up at Seafoam Stadium. I mean, they have arguably the biggest home field advantage in the AUDL right now. You can make an argument for the teams in altitude, for teams that have to go do a one-off. That is a pretty big advantage. But when it comes to just the conditions you're playing in from a swirly wind perspective, there's probably not anyone else with a bigger advantage in the entire UFA. And so this basically could be the decider right in the middle of the season of who's going to end up being the 1 seed. The expectation right now would be for Minnesota and Indy to be competing for the top 2 spots in the division. They were a clear 1-2 last year, with Minnesota even being a more clear 1, having beaten us twice. But that game has a lot of pressure on it. And from a schedule perspective, as you mentioned, we played Detroit 3 times this year, and Minnesota plays Chicago 3 times this year. Chicago, without a doubt, a better and more challenging team, actually beat Minnesota in Seafoam Stadium last year, which was a shocker to me. So there's a lot riding on this game. I mean, we could know in Week 8 who the 1 seed is, and there might not be a lot of drama going down the rest of the division for who's going to be 1 and 2.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that Minnesota struggles offensively. That's kind of been the story of the past season and a half. It's felt like they've struggled to consistently identify what they want to do on offense. Are we going to strike deep? Are we going to be a more matriculated, use all of our pieces, sort of small ball approach? It feels like they kind of go between different modes and styles on offense, but when they're indoors against you guys, it feels like they lean a little bit more into that deep attack. Josh Klain has had some great games indoors at Grand Park. Quinn Snyder, last year it was the rookie Marco Dragni who kind of took you guys to task in that indoor space. It feels like the indoor confines of Grand Park give a little bit of like a booster seat to this wind chill offense. And while it does neuter a bit of their defensive pressure and their ability, especially off of the pull, to come down, set the tone against you guys, Minnesota, I don't know. It feels like they have a bit of an edge in that environment. I mean, even last year in a high scoring game that had almost 50 combined scores in it between you two, it was Minnesota that prevailed because they got a couple of key blocks in the second half from Tanner Barkas and Sam Berglund, their 2 standout rookie players from 2023 on that D-line. What are you guys going to do differently, I guess, in this matchup without obviously giving your entire game plan away? What is sort of the approach then for this team that has kind of stepped up a bit in that environment and been able to both carry in some of that takeaway pressure that they led the league in last year in, and also elevate their offensive play? How are you guys going to kind of stymie that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, first off, is going to be player availability. Of course, both teams don't know what that looks like yet, but we were in a rare situation last year where we hosted them in the second week of the season, and actually being the home team had less players available for that game than they did, and it definitely hurt us in just our depth of our roster that day. And it was our second. It was their first game of the season, our second, and debuting some new people on the O line, still trying to figure out what we were doing and what our identity was on offense. We didn't really hit our stride there until week 3 when we went to Chicago, where you saw a marked improvement offensively from us. I wasn't there. That the Patrick Ewing effect, right? Like I left, we won our first game. Might be a little bit of a correlation there. I don't know, but it's one of those things where I think coming back this year, I expect our offensive unit to be probably similar, if not exactly the same as it was last year. So having that will be a big help for us, because offensively we really were okay, but we weren't as crisp as we were for that next 7 games when we went on that 7-game win streak or whatever it was last year. And we really need to see what we saw in weeks like 3 through 9 from us last year, 3 through 10. Because if we play that way offensively, it is going to be hard for them to continue to keep up, because that was really the difference. We had a lead in that game. I think we were up 4 in the second half. At one point, we had a good start, and we just didn't finish. We just continued to bleed points away as the game went on. And you saw the same thing. We went up to Minnesota. We were missing some key pieces. Myself, Nick Hutton, Lucas Canieres, all not there. That was an ugly game. And then in the playoff game, offensively, we actually didn't play bad, but our D-line, which had been converting so well all season as it had done the year before, also actually really struggled to convert breaks. And had our D-line played maybe the way they typically had, we might have found ourselves, taking a trip to Minnesota again for championship weekend. Offensively, we weren't perfect by any means. There were some easy things, but I think it just comes down for us. We just got to play clean. We do have some new things in the works this year. Of course, I'm not going to reveal what those things are, but I think we always know that Minnesota is going to be a challenge, because we talked about what builds a good program on our last pod and what you need to do to build that program. And Minnesota is a great example of this. They've kept the coaching staff around. They've been there for years. The players love the coaches and trust them. They have so many players coming back every year. Brandon Mattis, who has been there forever and just continues to mentor these new players coming in on defense, teaching them the Minnesota system defensively. And it feels like every year there's 1 or 2 new guys on defense that become humongous contributors. Most notably last year, Sam Berglund and probably Cameron Lacey as the 2 new additions who made huge impacts. So, I'm going to be really interested to see their new signings for this year. We already know that Matt Rader was a new signing. They just announced they re-signed Quinn Snyder, who of course is one of the best deep receivers in the entire league. And it'll be interesting. We, of course, announced some new signings as well. We have Jack Havey and Jake Kennev, who have been high impact players for Detroit. And I know it's Detroit, and a lot of people are like, oh, it's Detroit. But those 2 players have been standouts for them and are regarded as very good players, just obviously not working with as much talent around them across the rest of the roster all the time. So I'm really excited to go up with our new pieces. I'm excited, obviously, not to have to go to Seafoam Stadium, and I hope we don't have to take a trip up there for the playoffs either.
I mean, I just want to add that I'm also excited for your additions of the former Mechanix players in Havey and Kennev. I'm interested to see where you guys slot them in. I think they've both been very beneficial to that Mechanix team, and obviously been overshadowed by that enormous losing streak. But I wanted to get your opinion on what it would mean for each team to win this game, just in kind of like a sentence or two. What would it mean for Minnesota to win this game at Indy? And what would it mean for the AlleyCats for you guys to kind of avenge some of the more recent losses that you've had against this Minnesota team that you've been matched up with each of the past 2 postseasons? And it's felt like a pretty good head-to-head, and yet in the end, Minnesota has been able to eliminate you guys in each of the past 2 postseasons. So quickly, what would be the benefit of a win for either franchise?
I think for us, with the schedule, with the easier schedule that we do have, it almost just feels like that cements like the head to, like they're not going to catch us in the standings, we wouldn't think, if we win that game. And for them, if they win that game, it kind of maybe allows for a little bit of leeway because they do have a more difficult schedule than we do. So maybe they can afford to drop a game somewhere else and still end up with the 1 seed. So there's a lot that goes into it, but the biggest thing is just that head-to-head matchup that we don't have to worry about again. Most teams you play in your division, you play twice due to us both having 2 out-of-division games and how you have to have 6 home, 6 away, and how that all worked out. That's just not how things went this year. But it's just like that peace of mind knowing that once that game's over, that head-to-head is decided. You don't have anything else to worry about in that head-to-head matchup. And that tiebreaker at the end could definitely be the difference. I could very easily see us finishing with the same record and it coming down to who won that one game.
Yeah. I mean, for your guys' sake, I kind of hope you have a slightly better record, given that Minnesota is going to be hosting both Colorado and the New York Empire in 2 different Super Series games at Seafoam. So you guys better take advantage of that second easiest schedule kind of crown that you're wearing almost. But let's get into another matchup. I'll take the opportunity to highlight my first exciting game. The runner-up that I had to kind of leave on deck was the first Super Series game of 2024, that DC at Salt Lake Week 1 matchup. We'll get into that more and more. We talked about it 2 weeks ago when we premiered the Super Series schedule. But I wanted to go to a different Shred game, one that was within their division, and I think one of the better head-to-head matchups the past 2 seasons. Of course, I'm talking about Shred versus the Summit, and particularly when Salt Lake goes to visit Colorado, and that is in Week 4. It will be the number 1 most efficient offense from last season against the number 4 break rate team in Colorado's defense. Talking about number 1 Colorado's defense in opponent huck percentage rate. That is the lowest rate again from the 2023 season. They were number 3 in opponent offensive efficiency from last season, the 3rd lowest rate from last year. Also number 3 in lowest opponent red zone conversion rate allowed. All of those statistics are categories in which the Shred finished top 3 last season. And as we saw in both of those 1-goal finishes from 2024, these games come down to the wire in terms of who goes best in the West. I know last year LA defeated Colorado in the first round of the West Division playoffs, but were it not for those back-to-back wins during the regular season for Salt Lake against Colorado, it felt like the Summit still might have persevered to a West Division championship game appearance. And when you dig into the numbers of it, particularly on the defensive side of the disc, this Summit team rates itself as clearly a top 5, if not top 3 unit in the entire league. They had health issues on that side of the disc a year ago, and yet they still rate it out that way. It just feels like with a fully healthy rotation of defenders going into 2024, and I think smoothing out some of the mistakes that they made in their second season as a franchise. You know, you talk about that coaching staff, that front office. Colorado knows how to win and what they want to do with that team. It feels like a rejuvenation season, or a rebound season, I should say, for the Summit. And yet on the other side of the disc, when we were talking about what it takes to build a franchise that is successful last year, it really should almost start and end with a team like Salt Lake. I mean, in 2 seasons, they've gone from relatively unknown in Week 1 to begin their 2022 campaign on the road in San Diego against the 2-time division champs Growlers. They win that game. They go on to win the next night in LA. And ever since then, they've kind of been this almost like storybook franchise, from unknown to kind of runner-up last season. And yet it still feels like they have some proving yet to do in this West Division. You know, this is only going to be their 3rd season. They've had this meteoric rise. They've got this very established rival out in Colorado. And then they've got these other sort of challengers in the more established, I should say, West Division teams in LA, Oakland, Seattle, etc., that all feel like their arrows are pointed upward. And so this early season matchup of Salt Lake and Colorado feels both determinant as far as the top seeding in the division, but also as far as who's going to have the biggest target on their back going into the home stretch of the West Division schedule, who's going to kind of have to fend off the other challengers and try to get that all-important number one seed, a first-round bye, and a home playoff game. I just, it's going to come down to Shred versus Summit. As good as the Aviators became in the second half of last season, as upstart as Oakland looks, and to your point about Seattle, I'm really excited to see how high their ceiling pushes with that core built around Khalif El-Salam, Garrett Martin, Zeppelin Ronig, Jack Brown, Mark Munoz. They've got the playmakers, but at the top still sits the Shred, and right beneath that sits Colorado, it feels like, with LA neck and neck with them. I'm just really excited to see this sort of clash of styles between Colorado and Salt Lake. There's going to be stars. There's going to be schematic challenges. It feels like the kind of perfect buffet platter of opportunities for a divisional rivalry matchup.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because you have the Summit, who per game average as many huck attempts as anyone in the league, and then you have the Shred, who really, I felt like their identity in their first season was that deep shot. They wanted to play fast. They wanted to score. It seemed like, almost reminded me of the Steve Nash Phoenix Suns teams. Like, we have to score in like 12
7
seconds
or less.
Yes. And that's kind of what it felt like. And really, they reined that in last year. Jacob Miller really anchoring that O-line, and was just like about as ideal of a center handler as you could ask for. Like, they were so smooth last year, and the Summit season was as rocky as the mountains that they play in. They were up and down. It depended on who was there, injuries, whatever. And I think this is actually going to be the difference as we move forward. The Shred have already started 6 a.m. practices, y'all. Like, they've already started doing that, and something tells me that the Summit aren't out there grinding at 6 a.m. right now. I love the buy-in from the Shred. And almost all of it is talent that is local to that area too. They all look like a puppy with a new chew toy. Just like all the energy in the world. I will play forever. I have nothing will tire me out. And I don't know. There's just something infectious about watching them play, because they all play with so much energy and so much passion. And it's just fun. I mean, they have the Shred heads out there fueling them, of course, as well. Like, at home, it seems like they just...
this is going to be at Colorado.
That's true. That's true.
What I like about this matchup, and yeah. I wanted to interrupt you. Pardon me, to make one more point, particularly about the Salt Lake at Colorado game from last year. We talk about Salt Lake finished with the most efficient team. To your point, they sort of evolved this offense to become so much more, I think, dynamic. In 2022, it just felt like the Jordan Kerr show. 2023, it was so balanced in its attack. It reminded me a little bit, and I've heard Bryce Merrill say that they based their precepts off of Carolina's offense and what Mike DeNardis has built out there. But in terms of its approach to throwing from almost every position on the field and sort of cycling players from backfield and downfield positions, reminded me a lot of Indianapolis. Like your ability to sort of use a very high volume pivot handler in the center to set everything up, but you're really ratcheting horizontally across the field. Salt Lake did that so well all season long, and yet at Colorado last year, they had their second lowest offensive efficiency rating of the season, only succeeded by their poor performance in the championship game against the Empire's league-leading defense. So Colorado clearly got pressure on the Shred when they hosted them. And also, that game, I forgot about this in the time it's been since. Salt Lake was, what were they? Let's see, 9 of 9 on defensive conversions and 13 of 13 on their red zone opportunities.
Yeah, they were perfect.
This Summit team was third best in limiting opponents' red zone conversion rate last year, and Salt Lake was overall against them, I believe, 25 of 27 in their 2 games against Colorado for 92%. That would have clearly led the league last year if it was for a whole season. This Shred team simply shows up and executes against Colorado, even if they're going to be playing a little bit poorly in terms of their normal level of execution. But it reasons out that the Summit can get to this Shred team. They do have some individual matchups that I think they favor, which is not something a lot of teams can say against the Shred. And I know in the past, they've really relied on Cody Spicer to anchor that defensive performance. He's been so good against Jordan Kerr in their one-on-one matchups.
Mm-hmm.
Hearing a little rumors that Spicer might not be returning to the Summit in 2024. He's had a child recently, so that would be quite an absence, and I think give a bit of an edge to the Shred in, again, that week 4 first matchup of the season between these 2 West Division Titans.
Yeah, I mean, Cody Spicer, especially, I think back to the playoff game they had against the Shred in both of their inaugural seasons, just watching him make everything so difficult for Jordan Kerr. It wasn't as if Kerr wasn't getting any touches, but it's just he had to work so much harder for every touch. And then when he did have the disc, like Cody Spicer is a large man. That is not an easy person to throw around. Jordan Kerr a lot of times does have a height and length advantage on his matchup where it does make it a little easier to get some of those around throws, especially as a lefty. And, you know, if Cody Spicer's not there, that will be not just in that matchup, but in every matchup. That just makes things so much more difficult because how often, and last year, it was like he wasn't just the one leading the charge on defense, making things harder. Not always necessarily getting the block, but just gumming things up, sometimes on a handler, making resets nearly impossible. But he also was oftentimes leading the counterattack. He was so good with the disc in his hands last year. Admittedly, I'd like to see him push his advantage downfield sometimes when he does have a height advantage a lot of times on a turnover. But he was just so good on a turnover as well. It wasn't just the defensive pressure. It was leading the counterattack. But I mean, this game's always fun. Like, I think both of these teams get up for this game. I think Salt Lake, after not getting a victory against them in 2022, they really focused in on those games. Like you said, that red zone percentage is just insane against, not just against Colorado. That would have been insane against any team to go 25 for 27 because mistakes happen. The throws get tighter. There's less space to work with. That would have been impressive against a bottom of the league team. Like the fact that they did that against one of the best red zone defensive teams in the league is insanely impressive. So yeah, I think all of their matchups are going to be so exciting, but I think you're right, especially that one in Colorado, because it kind of just feels like Salt Lake is just too good at home, too much energy at home. But the game in Colorado, I think that'll be an instant classic, much like it was last year.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of a game that Colorado needs to have. They have the 3rd hardest schedule in 2024, according to stats. You know, they're going to be hosting you guys. They're traveling to Minnesota. They're hosting Salt Lake. They'll also play at Salt Lake. LA had their number towards the end of last season, despite Colorado owning those matchups the season and a half prior to the playoffs. It'll just be really interesting to see, I think, the barometer that this establishes for what we can expect from the Summit in 2024. But we've got to move on. We've still got 4 more games to get to. So I want to get to your next most anticipated matchup of the 2024 calendar.
Sure. Real quick, interesting stat I just thought of. I'm pretty sure this is right. I think Colorado was the only team to drop a game last year to the only team that made the playoffs that lost to a team that didn't make the playoffs. Because they lost that game at Oakland. I think they were the only playoff team to lose to a non-playoff team last year, which is interesting to think about. Oh, you know what? I lied. Carolina lost to Philly.
Yeah, and Chicago lost to Madison. I was starting to get in there.
Oh, I forgot Chicago was a playoff team. Is that bad? And we played them in the playoffs, but
I think the Union forgot they were a playoff team there for a second in that matchup. But let's not stick there for too long. I'm excited for the Union a little bit this season. Last year was a redevelopment year. They still made the playoffs. I'm writing about it in my preview article for the Central Division. I do think Chicago's going to get a little bit slept on entering this season, but
Yeah.
let's get to your next game.
Sure. My next game, sticking with Colorado, actually, and the reason is actually Colorado at Madison, and it's not really the Colorado at Madison matchup in isolation. It's something you already mentioned. They have to go to Madison, to Minnesota, and then they host us. So this is the first time we're going to my knowledge, that we're going to see a team from one division play 3 different teams from a different division. And not only that, the fact that they're playing at Madison, at Minnesota, and then hosting us. Madison expected to have some people coming back from injury who were gone last year. I would assume, they went into last year with no Kai Marcus, no Jacob Reuben Miller, no Kevin Pettit-Scantlin. It'll be interesting to see if any combination of those 3 people end up back, because that's 3 of their most impactful players, I would argue, especially KPS. But this will be our first time we can ever really kind of make a judgment about how good one division is versus another division. A lot of times we get these one-off games, like Indy goes to Atlanta week 1 last year and gets crushed. So clearly the Central sucks and the South is great, and it's like you make these huge statements based, like Minnesota goes to Colorado last year, missing like 6 of their top 20 guys, arguably 3 of their top 6 or 7 most impactful players they have. And all of a sudden everyone's like, Minnesota's terrible. Well, we saw what happened at championship weekend when they had their full roster, when Salt Lake and them both had their full rosters. And we saw that was obviously a great game, a very competitive game. So Colorado, who we all expect to be, probably 1 or 2 in the West this year, being able to play the team who finished first and the team who finished second, and a Madison team who I think definitely has a chance to get a playoff spot this year. I think it'll be between Chicago and Madison competing in that 4 spot, or in that 3 spot, excuse me. I just think that's really interesting. We'll kind of be able to get a somewhat of a picture about what does it look like when one of the first or second best team out West comes over to the Central and plays 3 of these teams. So I just find that kind of fascinating. Going to Breeze Stevens first, their last trip to Breeze Stevens didn't end so well for them when they went in and just really never felt like they were in the game against the Chicago Union in the 2022 playoffs. Obviously, they'll be playing the Madison Radicals, the actual home team there. It's just a great atmosphere, too. Watching a game at Breeze Stevens Field just always, it's a lot like watching the games in Salt Lake or in some of these other places. Like Breeze Stevens just always has a great crowd. It's a phenomenal atmosphere. And they play Minnesota the next day in Minnesota. So I think that'll be a really tough test for them. And I'm really interested to see how they come out of that weekend. And then we get to go out later, July 4th weekend, and play them too. So I think those 3 games in combination for Colorado just really intrigue me.
Yeah, I'll tell you the matchup I'm most excited for. Alex Atkins versus the Madison crowd. You talk about somebody who is like tailor-made to be the heel in that environment and like score 10 times and just do whatever kind of celebration he wants towards the Radicals faithful. I'm pretty excited about that. I'm also excited because Madison has kind of reversed their mojo, and I also wrote about this a little bit. It's like, for years, this Radicals team at Breeze Stevens Field was basically indefatigable as far as how it faced down against divisional opponents. You guys, Minnesota, Chicago, didn't matter. They had a 30-plus game home winning streak from 2013 through 2018, 19. And it wasn't until some interdivisional teams started to come into Breeze Stevens, most notably, I think, in 2016, when Seattle came in and won the famous all-time great semifinals matchup when they came back from that 7-goal second-half deficit. But then it kind of continued for the next 3 seasons. The Radicals hosted Dallas in 2017 in a mid-season, regular season bout. They lost pretty badly to the Roughnecks in that, the then Roughnecks, now Legion. 2018, Radicals host Carolina, get absolutely Donnybrooked by Nethercutt, Fairfax, Jack Williams, that offensive juggernaut of the Flyers, just could not slow them down. I think it was an 8-goal loss to the Flyers. I think to that point, It was the greatest defeat ever for the Radicals. 2019, they hosted, I believe there was one more. Excuse me. We could just jump forward to 2022. They hosted Austin, lost on a last-second drive as Kyle Henke threw the assist. The Soul come away with a big win, leading to their kind of up from under playoff season with their really hard strength of schedule. You know, this Radicals team has had some trouble with regular season matchups between interdivisional opponents, but that was sort of the past. Now they seem to struggle with divisional opponents. I'm wondering if they can sort of flip the other narrative and maybe present a challenge for this Colorado team that did have a lot of offensive struggles last year that maybe could be matched up with defensively, get down early in an adverse environment in Breeze. You know, there's just, I think, enough variables at play with how the Radicals perform in showcase games where they've typically shown up and battled into late third, early fourth quarter, despite losing in the past couple of seasons. I just think that there's a lot for Madison to gain and a lot for Colorado to lose. You know, inversely, there isn't a whole bunch for Colorado to gain other than, yeah, you should cash in that victory before you go and face Minnesota the next day in what will be a much bigger matchup. It's one of those games that I think if you were to just flatly address outside of where it's positioned in the schedule, really wouldn't present much interest. But given where it's nestled in, again, doubleheader weekend on the road, kind of in the slate of unfamiliar interdivisional central opponents, it's going to be weird for Colorado. It's not going to be, you know, hosting LA week 4 of the regular season as they did last year when they routed the Aviators. It's going to be a little bit more of what it felt like to host the Aviators in the playoffs, which is a completely different lineup and an unexpected foe.
Yeah, and it's just like there's so much interest for me too, because as it felt like Colorado was kind of falling apart as we got later in the season, right? Like, and then, you know, LA was like building as the season, right? So LA comes in at the end as they've been building up to that, and then they beat Colorado. I am really interested to see where the headspace is going to be at for Colorado this year, because they ended last year about as poorly probably as any of the playoff teams, like thinking about what they were shooting for last season and where they ended up. I think you know,
I was
like,
looking back at my preseason writing last year. I had a question as to whether Colorado would be the greatest challenger for New York. And I don't think, given how they entered last season and given some of the additions that they were bringing on, that that's an outlandish question. I mean,
no.
This is still a loaded Summit team every single season. Colorado is just a hotbed and a pipeline for talent. And so you can never discredit them in terms of, I think, their ceiling. But as they showed last year, there's sort of this floor that I think was a little bit lower than what a lot of people realized. And to LA and other teams' credit, Oakland too, Salt Lake, obviously, they took advantage of that. I think still, if you were to lay out Colorado in terms of just their talent on paper, you would list them clearly 1 or 2 in the division. And yet there's a lot more to the alchemy going on there, obviously.
Yeah, and it is interesting too, because they actually did give New York a pretty good game for a while. It was pretty solid. It got away from them at the end, but they competed, and that was kind of like, I think a lot of us were like, this is it. They've kind of turned the corner. They're going to be the Colorado we expected them to be. And then the playoffs rolled around and they just weren't. They just weren't that team. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to me to see how that weekend shakes out. I do think it is important to note the fact that the Minnesota game is the second game, because they're going to be on their second game. They're going to go in a little fatigued, and they're going to have to fight against that Seafoam Stadium wind and the Minnesota wind chill, who we would assume would have a stronger roster than they took to Colorado last year. Probably not, assuming everyone's healthy, that they're not missing as many people who couldn't make the trip. So I think that'll be a completely different game than what we saw last year when Minnesota traveled to Colorado. But yeah, I mean, that Madison game, like you mentioned, that's could be a trap game. They might have their eyes set on Minnesota and thinking about that game and that being the more difficult game. But Madison last year, despite their record, was in a lot of games. How many to start off the season? They lost back-to-back games on basically the last second.
They were
They
0-2, or
Yeah.
excuse me, they were 0-6 in 2-goal games last year.
Yeah, so like this wasn't a team, despite their record, that was just getting blown out, and the way they play defense, they keep the score low, and what that does is it just makes it so that if you do get a lead, it's usually not going to be a very big one, because they do slow the game down.
I'm sorry. Are you like reading my Word document that was previewing the Radicals? I literally have a whole section talking about one of their strengths being tempo control and how they just reduce the overall number of possessions in any given game. So you're just having to kind of struggle through scores. Like you're just going to be limited to 40 or less in almost every single Madison game that you face them. So every single scoring op is going to have a greater value associated to it than maybe a different game where it's more of a shootout and you're getting closer to 50 combined goals. But anyways, we've still got 3 more games to go to. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about those Central Division Colorado matchups. My second game, it's the granddaddy. Let's just call it that. It's the matchup that I go to first when I get the spreadsheet access to the master calendar. I'm talking about New York, DC, Week 7, Empire at Breeze. Last year, this particular matchup in this configuration yielded an overtime game. Obviously, the Empire came out on top in their last 8 matchups going back to the start of the 2021 season. New York is 7-1. It doesn't feel much like a rivalry. But if you've been paying any attention and have a pulse inside of you, of course it is. And I know that new Breeze head coach Lauren Boyle has downplayed the importance of this matchup for her team. And I totally appreciate that as being a good internal rhetoric. I think it's the kind of mindset that Breeze should adopt. You and I talked about that when we were discussing Lauren Boyle's hire in one of our previous episodes. However, as a viewing audience, as a fan of this league, it would be ludicrous for me to suggest that I'm not absolutely stoked about every single time we get Empire Breeze. I mean, it's just, it's two juggernauts. There's no other way to put it. And there's just a kind of, historical narrative and stylistic clashing that makes it the preeminent matchup in this league. And again, Empire have owned this matchup. But here's sort of the devil is in the details stat about this. In the last 6 games, all Breeze losses, DC is averaging just 13 turnovers on their own in those matchups. That would lead the league in any given season otherwise. And yet they have to play the best team in the league to a greater threshold than could be expected of pretty much anyone else in order to even have a shot at winning. Obviously, last year in their most recent matchup, the East Division title game, New York set a 4-quarter record for fewest turnovers in a game to give you the kind of bar the Breeze have to clear in this interdivisional rivalry, or in this divisional rivalry, But it's just, we're going to talk about this a ton. I've already talked about Empire Breeze a ton. It's a matchup that befuddles me, because I think there are ways in which the Breeze obviously have an ability to win this matchup, and yet the variety of ways in which New York has put them down is making that hypothetical less and less of any kind of a thing. It just feels more and more outlandish. I mean, you keep saying, okay, like let's get a game in which we'll make highlight plays and kind of punch back and forth with New York. That's what they got in the first matchup last year. You get that second half from Christian Boxley and Ben Ort, where they're kind of matching the Empire's ability to go deep, make plays downfield. And yet, in the end, it's Ben Yacht boxing out what feels like the entire DC Breeze D-line to pull in a disc in contest and dish for the assist in overtime in what would be the eventual Empire win. Then later in the season, you get the matchup at New York, and New York just kind of does what they do defensively all season. They just sort of wore the Breeze down. By the second half of that game, DC just looked tired, and New York cruised to a 4-goal win. Then in their third matchup, we get the aforementioned close to perfect offensive game. DC didn't get a break score in that game. So, Cam, I leave it to you. What do the Breeze need to do? I'm over the moon about this matchup. I'm going to tune in. I'm going to be excited as I am for any other game. And yet there's kind of coming in this creeping inevitability of New York's just going to win this. I don't know how. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know which two of their stars is going to have a go-off performance, but it's going to be one of them. So what can DC do? What do they need to bring to the table this year? You're going to say Thomas Edmonds. I know you're going to say Thomas Edmonds. Don't say Thomas Edmonds. You have to pick something else. But what can DC do against New York in 2024? What can they do to make this rivalry more contentious?
They can forfeit. Game's over. No, okay.
I asked you because I think you have such a particular perspective on this, right?
Yes.
Like you were in this seat against Madison for years.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to actually use that as like my launching off point. Because for those who don't know, from 2013 till through the first time we played Madison in 2019, we were 0-for. We didn't beat Madison a single time. I cannot tell you the amount of times that we had a lead in the fourth quarter and blew it. I cannot tell you the amount of times that we lost by 1 or 2 goals. It's countless. And it wasn't until 2019 at Madison, the year we made the championship weekend, that we finally broke through and beat them. And I will say that one of the most annoying things about that entire time was that after we had lost so many games against them, even though we had proven we could play with them, much like DC has proven that they can play with New York and keep the game close, I got so tired of hearing teammates kind of write those games off before the season as like, okay, well, we're not going to win those games, so like, what's our road to the playoffs? And that just pissed me off to no end, because I went into every Madison game thinking we were going to win. And we had plenty of opportunities. It wasn't like we were going up there and getting our doors blown off every time we went up there. Did we get blown out a couple times? Sure, like it happened. But they blew a lot of teams out. I didn't feel that bad about that. But we were in so many of those games. And it was, I would be so angry with my teammates about the mindset. And like, that's the first part. You have to have the mindset that you're going there to win. Like when we went and played New York in 2019 at championship weekend, and everyone was saying we were going to get destroyed, I had no doubt in my mind that we were going to win that game. And you know what? We played as close of a game with New York that year as just about anyone. Everyone was so surprised. I wasn't surprised. I had all the confidence in the world that we were going to go in there and perform. And that's the problem. There's a mindset thing there. And I'm going to bring this up when we talk about the next game that I have and how much I think mindset matters when you're playing against a team as good as New York. But that has to be the shift. I think DC respects New York too much. I do think they are on a pedestal, as new coach Boyle mentioned, but it's not just in a way of like, hey, we know this game's going to be hard. I think they respect New York too much and don't have enough of that like fight in them, at least outwardly and publicly. It doesn't appear to be, where they just go into it with the mindset that they're going to win. They go into it with the mindset that this is going to be a tough game and we're going to have to execute and we're going to have to play really well. And if we do that, we can have a chance to win. But you can't go in there with that kind of mindset against a team like New York. You have to go in there saying, we're going to slay this giant. We're going to do this. And I just don't think DC has shown that kind of fight. I mean, you've mentioned on here before, but like, where are their biggest players when these teams play in these games, especially when it happens in the playoffs? It kind of feels like in the playoffs in these games, some of those big players aren't showing up, or they are having some of their worst games of the year. Is that pressure because they feel it? They feel the pressure? Is that just New York game planning and doing something different? Because to me, it doesn't look that way. It looks like some of their players, biggest players, most important players, shrink in these games from time to time. And you just can't have that. Your stars have to show out and they have to play with all the confidence in the world. And I just don't think DC does that consistently.
Yeah. I think it's also an artifact of particularly the kind of slower starts. It feels like they always allow New York to do their second half, fourth quarter magic, right? Like they're always within striking distance. It's always either DC edging back from a slight deficit or them slimly holding on to a 1-goal lead. For once, I would love to see them, and you know, point to the last time some team got up 4-1 on New York, and I'll nod at that. But like, I would love to see them come out hot. I would love to see them come out, with the energy that they got after that David Bloodgood Self Callahan in the playoff game when they did kind of take a slight lead. They had that energy and that sort of ferocity that they needed to punch with New York for but a moment, and then New York just started feeding Ben Yacht the disc deep, and that was basically ball game. It to your point, it feels like there are individual instances of them going punch for punch. Obviously, Boxley Ort in the week 3 matchup during the regular season last year. I thought during the second half of the playoff game, Ort and Tyler Monroe definitely found a bit of a rhythm connecting for the DC offense. But other than kind of, these individual duos that show up almost out of necessity, there isn't a holistic effort in the way that we're so used to seeing with DC on offense. But as much as you maybe want to take DC's offense to task, I don't think that that's been the problem. I think it's been this defense, which is one of the harder units, I think, to assess, because when you look at their talent and you look how they play in one-on-ones and you just look at certain ways in which they launch the counterattack, when Alexander Fall is just blowing up an underpass of the layout block and it's Merriman picking up in transition and just bombing it to Fall still streaking deep, or Musa Ja or somebody else freeing themselves up into space, it looks spring-loaded for DC's counter, but that's almost never happened against New York. The lone break score that they got was on a Self Callahan. I think earlier I said that they had no breaks. They got the one break on David Bloodgood's Self Callahan off of his own pull. I mean, they need to generate more pressure. They need to figure out a way to replicate, I thought, what was a good game plan in the 2022 divisional title game, where they flummoxed Oscar a bit. They got some more stickiness in the backfield. I remember Jasper Tom had a terrific game on Salomon Rushmeyer-Bailey in that, just sort of sticking on him in that backfield space. It feels like those performances for DC's defense against New York don't come as often as maybe they would like, and that I don't know how necessarily they get from A to B to construct that, but I'm excited to see new coach Boyle if she can sort of bootstrap that up. And I think, again, going back to what I said earlier in the episode, I think it's good that she has this approach of don't put New York on that pedestal, but of course we're going to be watching. Of course all eyes are going to be on this matchup.
I think the last thing I'll kind of point to is if you want to see where the biggest disparity is between these two teams, there's two areas you can really look at. And one is break percentage. The Empire last year were almost a full 6% better in that category than the Breeze were. And the other one is blocks. In just one, so the Empire played 15 games, Breeze played 14. So these are not per game numbers, but the Empire had 44 more blocks. And I know they didn't get all 44 of those in one game. So that's a big difference. You talk about the defensive pressure and the D line maybe being where they're let down. I think if I want to be more specific, I think it's in the downfield defending. I mean, you just talked about, sorry about that. You just talked about how Ben Yacht just had the greatest game that any receiver has ever had when they were playing in that playoff game. And you know what? That's downfield defense. Now, can you do things in the handler space to kind of make those shots more difficult to get off? Sure. But with enough disc movement, you're going to be able to get those deep looks. But Ben Yacht, as unguardable as he can look in general sometimes, it feels like he is actually unguardable when he's playing against DC. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just he gets up for those games, which, does happen. That is a real thing. But it just seems like no one on DC has an answer for him. Almost, I don't know if they're scared of him. I literally don't know what it is, but it is uncanny.
I'll seize back the blame here from DC's D-line or something. I think you got to put more of just respect on Yacht's name. It's one of those things, and I touched on this in an episode towards the end of last season. Yacht in big games, in like playoff elimination games, rivalry games, he is the best player on the planet. I mean, we've seen it in 2 All-Star games when he just kind of asserts himself. It's a different level. The field shrinks around him. He starts looking like he's running downhill, and he makes otherwise great defenders that DC did have in that game just look not up to the task. It's just not fair to ask somebody to go and guard Yacht one-on-one in space. I don't know that outside of maybe 2 to 3 physical specimens in the league that's really possible. And that's on Yacht. That's not necessarily DC not doing enough. I think that's just a legend asserting himself in big games. But you've got one last game to get to. I've got one last game to get to. And you're going to go with another Empire pick. So have at it.
Speaking of people who can match up with Yacht, James Pollard, anyone? That guy, that is a matchup I would watch all day. Just jump balls with James Pollard and Ben Yacht going up. Sign me up for like 15 of those a game, please. That would be phenomenal to watch, because if there is one person in the entire league who I think just absolutely does not fear Ben Yacht, it is James Pollard. I think he, size-wise, they are similar, and I just think he has so much comfort. But we're talking about New York going to Philly in week 8, middle of the season. We'll kind of know some things about these teams at that point. And Philly, as much as we talk about, is DC going to be the team who knocks off New York? Philly's played New York about as well as anyone. They don't do it as consistently as DC. They do have a tendency to have a really bad game against New York from time to time. Go back to their first game against New York last year, where I think I checked the game barely, like it was still the first quarter and they were already down like 7 goals. So
I'll do the synopsis. The first quarter ends with Philly just sort of lackadaisically throwing the disc on a swing pass, Ben Katz picking it off and in one motion throwing the disc into the end zone as the buzzer sounds, and Jack Williams skying out 3 Philly players.
Yep.
That's how that game went.
Yeah. And I think at that point it was like 9-1 or 8-1 at the end of the first
I think
quarter.
I think it was actually 7-1 on that score.
Okay.
And there was even kind of like an audible groan almost. I don't know if anyone in particular, if it's just a summation of noises in that moment.
So here's the thing. Philly, who I think we can agree is top to bottom not as talented as DC, but has the ability to, it seems like at least once a year, punch up with New York. They took them to overtime last year. I think they might have taken them to overtime. I don't know. They played a tight game in 2022 as well. But here's the thing. Here's the difference between why Philly, a clearly less talented team than DC, can punch up with New York, and DC punches up but can never punch through. Philly has that confidence that I was talking about. When they go to play New York, it's not, oh, we might be able to compete with them. Like, we might be able to do this. No. They're going in there every time thinking they're going to win. They're going in there every time.
Voice? Was that your Breeze voice? Is that what like Breeze players sound in your head?
That's what they sound like to me. Yes, right there. That was my DC. That was like, you pick your player. I'm not calling anyone.
Okay, but now I need to hear your Philly accent.
Nobody wants that. But you know what? I think like the Philadelphia Phoenix so embody the way I've always felt like envisioned a Philly sports fan and like Philly sports in general. It is like that overconfidence and like that bravado that just seems like it has no end. And honestly, it's what you need when you're going into big matchups. Like, you have to feel like you're the top dog. And if you go into it thinking that you're not the top dog, then you're right, you're not. And I just don't think that's a problem with Philly. They have playmakers. They have someone like James Pollard, who is not afraid of Ben Yacht. And, who knows where Yacht will be playing this year. He's gone back and forth between offense and defense. While he played most of his points on defense last year, once playoffs came around, we saw him on offense. So it'll be really interesting to see where he's at. I do think that does matter, but he is not somebody that Philly's afraid of. And it feels like they match up with him about as well as anyone. And I think it is because they don't fear him, and they do have some big bodies that can go match up with him. I mentioned on the last podcast, but if Jordan Ryan can play this season like he did in 2022, kind of return to that form and kind of be like just that really solid anchor on their O-line. Sean Mott feels unguardable, like he can just kind of go wherever. And if he can continue to distribute from like the middle of the field, and if they can just play with that same confidence, which they will because they're Philly and because they could go into that game without a win on the season and feel like they're the better team and feel like they're going to win, then I anticipate this being a really exciting matchup. They play that crowd friendly ultimate, as Charlie Hoppus, told us back in 2022. It is fun to watch. And last year they got up for a big game against Carolina and won. Like, they've proven that they can compete with the top dogs. They play DC really tough consistently. They haven't punched through that matchup, just like DC hasn't punched through the New York matchup. But I have more confidence actually in Philly somehow finding a way to beat New York than DC.
All right. Cut his mic. Somebody cut his mic.
No, I'm serious. Tell me why I'm wrong. I mean, like the stats would tend to say that that neither one is a good option if you look at it. But I just think
no one's a good option right now against New York, Cam. No one is. That's the truth of it. They're blowing people out at championship weekend the past 2 seasons.
I'm writing it in ink. If New York loses a regular season game to a divisional opponent, and I say that because they do have some, I would be curious about the game in Atlanta. But if they lose to a divisional opponent this year in the regular season, it's going to be Philly. I'm calling it right now. Okay. Philly or no one.
Okay. I will say, one of the things that I'm most intrigued to watch carry over into 2024 from last season is the completely underrated play of Philly's defense. We talk so much about Sean Mott and James Pollard and Jordan Ryan and Greg Martin and all these kind of highlight-fueled offensive players, Calvin Trissolini making the all-rookie team last year. There's just a lot of excitement for the Philly offense. It was that defense that I thought was the backbone of a lot of their successes. They were third in defensive conversion success rate last year, and the real tragic part is that they had their 2 worst defensive conversion performances against New York. In that overtime game at Philly, they converted just 2 of 9 on break chances when normally they're around almost 60% for the season. It's just, it feels like Philly, to your point about their confidence, they're there so often against DC and New York. You understand where it comes from, and yet there isn't that foothold. I'm so interested to see what happens if there's sort of that dog that catches the proverbial bumper of the car. Like, it feels like part of what's motivated them is the chase that's been so fundamental to their development. I want to see what version of Philly we get if they do knock off New York, obviously, but also DC, or now even Boston in a real sense. They've obviously had a victory or 2 over the past couple of seasons against Boston, but Glory have kind of held their number. It feels like, for as much as maybe the ceiling in some of our minds, and especially for how Philly positions itself vocally in the league, they should be way up here. I get messages from them about how they should be ahead of basically every West team, which I don't know where that's coming from, but if Phoenix catch fire, what does that version of them look like? What does the actually confidence and can back it up Philly look like? Like, is that a championship contender? I don't know. I think there's still so much left in the hypothetical realm for them.
You mentioned earlier Colorado, this high ceiling they have, but also we kind of discovered last year the low floor that they could have, and that's exactly how I would describe Philadelphia. They have as many playmakers on offense as anyone. They have some guys like Paul Owens comes to mind on defense that just they can just get it. And like you said, like their defensive line conversion percentage was just out of this world last year, except for like that one game, right? And they didn't even have to be as good as they were all year. They just needed to be close, right?
Mhm.
2 of 9. They on the season they were 55%. If they were just even 4 out of 9, right? That's a win. That's the game that breaks the streak that we're talking about going into this year. So that being said, it is New York. There's a reason that number was lower. New York is a fantastic team, but I do think that there is a chance that they do it. I'm really excited to see how their season goes. I love that also this matchup is in week 8, so we will have some time to kind of see where each team stands at that point. Of course, we know New York's going to be great. How great we'll see, but they're going to be great regardless. I'll be interested to see if Philly has kind of settled in, found some traction in the division at that point, because like you mentioned, they've struggled against Boston the last couple of years as Boston's kind of got more buy-in and had more roster consistency throughout the season last year. We saw what kind of team that they could be. They're going to have to compete with the DCs of the world as well. So I don't know. I'm really excited for this matchup. I would expect probably something similar to last year. One of their matchups in New York might not go so well, and the other one I think we're going to get a really great game. So it'll be fun to watch. Regardless, we know there's going to be some highlights for sure.
Here's the other thing Philly has to do to set themselves up well for this game. They need to not go 0-for in their first 3 to 4 games of the season. They started 2022 0-3. They started last year 0-4. It's so hard to position this Philly team as a true contender when they just put their foot straight in the bucket to begin these seasons that are so, I think, relatively otherwise rightfully hyped. Like, they should be excited about this team. This is a team you should get up for, but they just need to figure out that leverage between expectations and reality right now.
Yeah, and they do have a pretty tough start to the schedule too. Like, by the time they get to this game, they're not playing their easier games before this, so not a lot of them at least. So
they have
before
the 7th hardest schedule according to Daniel Cohen's rankings.
So looking at their schedule right now, like by the time they play that game, they're gonna have already played at New York. They're gonna have already played at DC. As far as their home games leading into that, they'll have had a home game against Boston, a home game against DC. But they won't have played Montreal yet, for instance. They'll have a home game against Toronto. I mean, it is possible that they could go into that game with only 1 or 2 wins, and that's week 8 of the season. Because we did talk about they have a high ceiling, but that low floor did show its ugly head numerous times last year. They went on the road to Pittsburgh, who I think they are clearly a more talented team than, and they had a lead, and they just barely scraped by with a 1-goal win in that game. And that kind of seemed like where the floor was for them. Like, what are you doing? But it's going to be fun. I think I think that matchup's going to be the one to watch for because it's in Philly. But let's move on to your last game that you chose for your 3 games you wanted to look at.
Well, this will be a first for the division. We haven't touched on this one yet. We're going to go south. We're going to go into Texas, and we're going to go week 10, Atlanta at Austin. This has been one of the better, I feel like, undercard rivalries that's been brewing even before these teams became more formidable post-pandemic 2020 season. Going back even to the Souls' first season in this league in 2016 when they came in with Dallas, Atlanta was kind of positioned as the number 2 or 3 team in the South. 2016, they had a wild card berth. They won their first round game at Carolina, then went and faced Dallas in the South Division final, got kind of blown out by Dallas in that season. But since then, for a couple seasons there, it was the Soul that kind of held the advantage against Atlanta. Atlanta struggled through 2017, 18, 19 seasons a bit, kind of in the middle of the pack in the South. Obviously, they've had this sort of rebirth since, but so have the Soul, right? I mean, they spent the better part of a half decade playing little brother to Dallas, but Austin is that no more. They've been absolutely ascendant the past couple of seasons, and more to the point, they've basically eliminated Atlanta in each of the past 2 seasons. They did outright, obviously, in last year's epic double overtime thriller between the Soul and Hustle in the South Division title game, but they also did during the regular season in 2022 when they hosted the Hustle. Then on the second game of a Texas back-to-back mid-July heat, Hustle had a lead going into the fourth quarter, but the Soul took it back at home, winning that game and then eventually clinching a playoff berth. They would go on to lose a first-round game against Carolina, but the Soul got a foothold in what would be then their victories over Carolina and then Atlanta in this past season's playoffs. This South Division game just feels like so much is going to hinge on it. Again, in a season where all three of the top teams in the South feel like they could have a rightful hold or place on first place and a possible first round bye. This Week 10 matchup just feels so pivotal. It's going to come within the last month of the regular season. You have the number 3 most efficient offense in Atlanta going up against the number 1 break rate team of all time last year in the Austin Soul. Now, obviously, that number was inflated given the strength of their schedule. Texas wins and just the general play of that division in 2023. But it still stands to be a great stylistic matchup between a really efficient offense in Atlanta and just a get after a defense in the Soul. We saw that in the title game, or divisional title game, last year, where, to your point a couple episodes ago, Soul did affect how the Hustle wanted to perform their offense. But I felt like the Hustle battled back in the middle portion of that game and reasserted themselves and their style. They were 7 of 10 on deep looks in that game. And in general, it's felt like that has been an edge that Atlanta can leverage a little bit more against Austin. Austin surrendered the 3rd most HUC completions per game to opponents last season, surrendering over 8 completions on deep attempts to opponents. Conversely, Atlanta has been clearly the best hucking team, and I don't mean that with the pun, in the UFA. Jokes aside, the past 3 seasons, they've been at the top of the league, both in terms of HUC completion rate and also average HUC completions per game. You talk about Draco Taylor, you talk about Bobby Lay. This is a team that can activate deep space, maybe take advantage of some of the aggressiveness and one-on-one coverage that Austin relies on with their defensive looks. But obviously, the Soul got the better of them in each of the past 2 seasons. Austin holds a bit of that emotional edge. This just feels like one of those games, and especially after last year's playoff matchup, that could really elevate this whole rivalry into kind of that pantheon of Colorado, Salt Lake, DC, New York. I think Carolina, DC is up in that space. I think Minnesota, Indy is becoming that space. You just expect these teams to be at each other's throats any given year.
Yeah, and this is the division of all the divisions where I think it's the hardest to figure out. Not just, I think we have a pretty clear idea of who's going to make the playoffs, but like in what order, who knows? Like I could see any order of these 3 teams between 1 to 3, and it wouldn't surprise me no matter how it shakes out. And obviously, given what happened last year in the last game, these 2 teams played against each other. Like I think both matchups they have next year are going to be this year are going to be highly anticipated. Austin's going to be looking for to continue where they left off. Atlanta's going to try to prove that they are the better team, which they did prove during the regular season last year, but they clearly were not that same matchup when they got to the playoffs. So I like this game being down in Austin with those Texas wins you mentioned. I'll be curious to see if those play a factor. But Austin's just so much fun to watch. Like honestly, I enjoyed even watching their games when they were playing against Dallas and Houston. It just feels like a really fast pace of play. In some ways, I feel similarly about them to the way I'd say like the 2022 version of the Shred, where it just feels like they're out there having a lot of fun, playing really fast. They've got a bunch of guys on their team who like to make big throws and big plays. I mean, you could probably make a highlight reel just from Kyle Hinkie that could just stand alone as like the UFA highlight reel. He has some of these plays that are just insane. Of course, the greatest from several years ago, the block in double overtime.
Here's the thing, though. I'm an unabashed Kyle Henke fan. I'm starting to have this question, and I've pitched this to somebody else. How many more seasons is he going to be the better Henke? Have you been watching Lil Stinker, Mark Henke? That
Yeah.
dude is on the come up, man. I think that he's going to have a big 2024, and if he's available after his college season, I think he will be, especially by this Week 10 matchup.
For
He
sure.
could have a very deciding factor in this matchup. He has been playing very, very good matchup defense. I know there's a bunch of defenders we kind of get to with Joey Wiley, Matt Armour, a lot of really good Oliver Fay, a lot of really good defenders in that Seoul D-line rotation. Kyle Henke has been, to your point, one of the premier players in this league the past several seasons. Mark might have something to say about who's the best Henke when all things are said and done.
Yeah, it's true. And, I really liked a lot of what I saw from Austin last year, too. Duncan Fitzgerald last year was just really great for them.
He was my vote for most improved.
Yeah, he was so good for them last year. I love the energy we talked about in our last episode that, like, Steven Najee brings, and that energy just kind of radiates throughout the team. I think the other interesting thing when I look at these two teams as well is for Atlanta, it feels like it's a lot of the old guard. Like, they have so many veteran players, guys who are in their early to mid 30s and are kind of like, it feels a lot to me like maybe in some ways their window for competing for a title might be closing in the next couple of years, because so many of their important pieces are around my age, and they're, most people aren't playing as long as I am, or as long as Matt Smith is right there with me. I think he's a year younger than me. And Draco Taylor is another one of those guys, is in his 30s. Like, how much longer are they going to be able to keep this core together? They've been incredibly good together, but they might be on the tail end of this run. And you can't just replace people like that on an O-line that's been one of the top ones in the league over the last, 2 to 3 years. So I'm really interested because I feel like there is a bit of time pressure when it comes to the Atlanta Hustle. I don't feel the same way about the Austin Soul, where I kind of feel like they're just heating up into their prime of a lot of their players' careers. So this might be Austin on the upswing, whereas I feel like Atlanta maybe is almost at a plateau right now, where, like, this is who they are. They're very good and they have the capability to play with the top teams in the league, but for how much longer? So for me, there's a lot of pressure on this season for the Hustle, because this might be the last season this band stays together. So I'll be really interested to see how they go throughout the season. And by this time in Week 10, we'll have a very good idea of what the playoff picture is looking like between those two teams in Carolina. So, yeah.
Yeah, just two last little points. Obviously, Atlanta won the South Division regular season last year. They were 10-2, finished in first place. But Austin, 3-1 in their last 4 meetings hosting the Hustle. That goes back to the end of the 2017 season. So, bit of an edge there for the Texas team. That will do it for this episode of Swing Pass. Again, the entire 2024 UFA schedule for all 24 teams is available at watchufa.com. You can start going there, buying tickets, planning out your summer months. I'm already booked up for the entire months of April, May, June, July, August. It's going to be a long season, but we'll be here the entire time to help guide you through it. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, we'll say goodbye. See you soon.